In the year 1851, Thornwood Plantation lay along the western bank of the Tombigbee River in Mobile County, Alabama. The land was flat and broad, broken only by shallow rises, where the ground resisted flooding, and by long fingers of swamp that crept inward from the river's edge. Cotton fields covered most of the dry ground. Beyond them stood the tree line, dense with cypress and tupelo, where the earth darkened and softened into waterlogged soil. From a distance the plantation appeared orderly. Rows of white cotton stretched evenly toward the horizon. Smoke rose at predictable hours from kitchen chimneys. Bells rang at dawn and dusk. To those who owned it, Thornwood represented stability and profit. To those who labored there, it was a place of repetition, silence, and constant watchfulness. The main house stood on a slight elevation above the fields, built of painted wood and framed by tall columns that gave it the appearance of permanence. A wide veranda wrapped around its front, overlooking the land as if to assert ownership through height alone. Behind the house, set far enough to be seen but never mistaken as equal, stood the slave quarters. 2 rows of cabins faced one another across a dirt yard beaten hard by years of bare feet. Each cabin was built of rough logs chinked with mud, their floors packed earth, their roofs patched with uneven boards. Gaps between the logs let in wind during winter and insects during summer. In heavy rain, water crept across the floors, soaking bedding and clothing alike. At the center of the quarters stood the whipping post. It was a simple thing, little more than a thick wooden beam set upright in the ground, but it was visible from every cabin door. No matter where one stood in the yard, the post could be seen. It was not always used, but it never needed to be. Its presence alone enforced memory. Each day at Thornwood began before the sun rose. A bell rang from near the big house, its sound carrying across the fields and into the cabins. Men and women rose quietly, careful not to speak too loudly or too slowly. There was no need to hurry, yet no allowance for delay. Movements followed patterns learned over years. Cornbread was eaten cold or warmed briefly over small fires. Children were left in the care of those too old to work the fields. By first light, lines of workers moved toward their assigned labor, tools carried without conversation. Jacob, known to the plantation records by that name alone, woke each morning before the bell. He had learned long ago that waking early allowed him to prepare himself mentally for the day ahead. He sat on the edge of his sleeping pallet, his feet pressing into the cool dirt, and listened. The plantation had a sound before dawn. Insects hummed softly. Birds stirred in the trees. Somewhere, water moved through reeds. These sounds belonged to the land and did not change. Human sounds came later. Jacob was tall, though hunger and labor had shaped his body into a narrow frame. Years of work had hardened his hands and shoulders. He moved carefully, conserving energy, never rushing. His face remained still in most circumstances. This was not indifference but habit. Expression invited attention, and attention invited danger. He dressed in the same worn clothes he had worn the day before, clothes patched many times by his own hand. As a carpenter and general laborer, Jacob did not work exclusively in the fields. He repaired cabins, fences, and machinery. He mended doors in the big house and adjusted shutters after storms. This work gave him a measure of movement denied to most field hands. It also placed him under closer observation. Skill was valued, but intelligence was not. Jacob understood this distinction and acted accordingly. He worked efficiently but without pride. He did not offer suggestions. He waited to be told what to do, even when he already knew. The cotton gin stood near the river landing, its wooden frame housing metal teeth that tore fiber from seed with relentless regularity during harvest season. Even when not in use, it required constant maintenance. Jacob often worked there alone, replacing worn parts or aligning shafts damaged by strain. The gin's machinery bore scars similar to those on the people who served it. Repairs were temporary. Damage was expected. Master Cornelius Whitfield rarely visited the gin. He left such matters to his overseer. Whitfield preferred distance. He rode out in the mornings on horseback, inspecting fields from afar, or traveled to Mobile for business. When he passed through the quarters, conversation stopped. Bodies stiffened. Whitfield did not shout often. He did not need to. His authority was assumed and enforced through others. Mistress Constance Whitfield managed the household with strict attention to order. She believed discipline was a form of moral instruction. Her cruelty took quieter forms. Extra work assigned for imagined slights. Meals withheld for perceived laziness. Correction administered through the overseer rather than directly, which allowed her to view punishment as necessity rather than choice. She spoke often of Christian duty. Silas Cutcher, the overseer, handled daily enforcement. His presence shaped the rhythm of labor. He rode between fields on horseback, whip coiled loosely in one hand. His voice carried easily, and when he spoke, it was usually to criticize rather than instruct. Those under him learned to anticipate his moods by watching his posture and listening for changes in his tone. A good day was one in which he did not stop. Drivers, enslaved men elevated to supervisory roles, enforced Cutcher's orders within the fields. They walked among the rows, counting baskets, watching for slowed pace. Their position offered slight protection from the hardest labor but placed them in constant danger of being blamed for failures beyond their control. They were both resented and pitied by others, a tension that rarely found words. Beyond Thornwood's boundaries, the presence of slave patrols was constant. At night, horses moved along the county roads. Lantern light flashed through trees. Any black person found without a written pass risked immediate punishment. The patrols were known by name and habit. Their routes were discussed quietly among the enslaved, not as a plan for resistance but as a means of avoidance. Fear was managed through knowledge, however limited. Jacob paid attention to all of this. He did not speak of it openly. Observation was his primary defense. He noticed when Whitfield traveled and when he returned. He noticed how often Cutcher drank and how deeply he slept afterward. He noted which patrols rode together and which men lagged behind. This information was not gathered with rebellion in mind. It was simply part of living. For years, Jacob had survived by maintaining distance from attachment. He shared food when he could but avoided closeness. He did not form ties that might be broken by sale or punishment. His life had taught him that loss was inevitable and often sudden. Caring too deeply only increased suffering. Evenings at Thornwood were quiet. After dusk, fires burned low. Conversations, if they occurred, were whispered. Songs were sung softly, their meanings layered and often misunderstood by those who overheard. Jacob sat outside his cabin when the weather allowed, watching the dark settle over the fields. The swamp beyond the trees remained unseen but present. Its existence felt more than observed. It represented uncertainty and danger, but also a place where rules weakened. On Sundays, work slowed but did not cease entirely. The enslaved were allowed limited time to themselves, though always under watch. Some attended services led by white preachers who emphasized obedience. Others gathered in the woods later, speaking more freely among trusted company. Jacob attended neither often. He spent his time repairing personal items, sharpening tools, or walking near the tree line, careful not to cross into forbidden areas. Life at Thornwood followed this pattern day after day. Nothing changed quickly. Punishments occurred, but they were expected. Sales happened and people disappeared without ceremony. Births occurred, though children belonged to the plantation from their first breath. Death came quietly most of the time, marked by brief gatherings and unmarked graves. In this way, Jacob lived. He survived. He worked. He watched. He believed that endurance was the only form of resistance available to him. At this time, he still believed that survival through obedience, however bitter, was preferable to the certainty of death. This was the condition of Thornwood Plantation before anything began to shift, before attention sharpened, before loss became personal, before patience ceased to be sufficient. The first changes were subtle, the kind that could be mistaken for coincidence by anyone not accustomed to measuring life in small shifts. At Thornwood, change rarely announced itself. It arrived quietly, altering routines by degrees until the new pattern felt unavoidable. The spring of 1851 began with unusual scrutiny. Overseer Kutcher lingered longer in the fields, riding back and forth rather than passing through. His horse stopped more often. His eyes followed movements that had once gone unnoticed. Baskets were weighed twice. Hands were inspected for imagined idleness. The drivers were spoken to sharply and corrected in front of others, a signal that authority was tightening its grip. The cause was never stated openly. No announcement was made, but people understood without explanation. Cotton prices had shifted slightly. Profits were threatened, if only in the minds of those who measured their worth in numbers and bales. When profit was uncertain, discipline increased. This was an established rule as predictable as weather. Sarah noticed the change first inside the big house. Her duties as a house servant placed her closer to the Whitfields than most enslaved women, and proximity brought exposure. Mistress Whitfield's instructions grew more precise. Tasks that had once been accepted as complete were now deemed insufficient. Floors were scrubbed again. Stitches were undone and redone. Meals were criticized despite meeting the same standards that had satisfied guests only weeks before. Sarah responded by working more carefully, not faster. Speed invited mistakes, and mistakes invited punishment. She had learned this lesson in Virginia long before her sail south. Her posture remained respectful. Her eyes stayed lowered unless addressed directly. She spoke only when spoken to, her voice steady and controlled. Yet even perfect compliance did not prevent attention. Master Whitfield began entering rooms without reason, lingering in doorways, watching. His presence carried a weight distinct from that of his wife. It was less structured, more unpredictable. Where Mistress Whitfield's cruelty followed a logic of order and correction, her husband's interest followed no such pattern. The first incident occurred on a warm afternoon in late February. Sarah was carrying folded linens down the hallway when Whitfield stopped her with a gesture of his hand. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He asked where she had come from, though he already knew. He commented on her posture, her appearance, her usefulness to the household. His tone suggested appraisal rather than conversation. Sarah answered briefly and attempted to pass. Whitfield stepped aside only after allowing the moment to stretch uncomfortably long. When she reached the kitchen, her hands shook as she placed the linens down. No physical contact had occurred. No words had been spoken that could be repeated as accusation, yet the meaning was clear. She did not tell Jacob that evening. There was nothing to tell that could be acted upon. Fear without remedy was a burden she carried alone. Over the following weeks, Whitfield's attention became more frequent. He commented on her work in ways that blurred into observation of her body. He stood too close. He asked questions that required her to answer aloud, forcing eye contact under the pretense of instruction. Each encounter left her tense long after it ended. Jacob noticed changes as well, though he did not know their cause at first. Sarah grew quieter in the evenings, her thoughts turned inward. She slept restlessly. When she spoke, her words carried caution layered over caution. Jacob did not press her. He had learned that pressing could cause as much harm as silence. At the same time, his own work began to attract sharper oversight. Repairs he completed were re-examined. Kutcher questioned his methods, though the results were sound. Jacob answered calmly, explaining only what was asked. Kutcher seemed dissatisfied with answers that offered no submission beyond compliance. One morning, Kutcher ordered Jacob to assist in the fields, a task usually assigned to others. The order itself was not unusual, but the manner was. Kutcher watched closely as Jacob bent to the work, nodding his pace, his posture. After an hour, he criticized Jacob for not moving quickly enough, despite his basket meeting expected weight. Jacob accepted the rebuke without protest. He adjusted his pace slightly, careful not to appear defiant. Kutcher rode away eventually, but not before delivering a warning disguised as advice. Skilled hands, he said, were still hands. No one was indispensable. The warning was unnecessary. Jacob already knew. The plantation's atmosphere grew heavier. Conversations among the enslaved became more cautious. People avoided gathering in numbers, even where permitted. At night, patrol riders seemed to pass closer to the quarters, their horses' hooves audible for longer stretches of time. Lantern light lingered near the tree line. Rumors circulated quietly. A man from a neighboring plantation had been whipped for speaking back to an overseer. A woman had been sold south after refusing a master's advances. These stories were not new, but their repetition served as reminder. Compliance did not guarantee safety. It only delayed consequence. Sarah's pregnancy became known in early March. Mistress Whitfield learned of it first, informed by another house servant whose loyalty lay with the household rather than the quarters. The announcement was met without warmth. Pregnancy was noted as fact, its implications measured in future value rather than present condition. Master Whitfield's reaction was more difficult to read. He spoke of the child as property yet to mature, his tone calculating. He did not withdraw his attention. If anything, it intensified. Sarah felt eyes on her even when he was not present. She moved more carefully, aware that her condition made her both more valuable and more vulnerable. Jacob learned of Whitfield's behavior only in fragments. Sarah spoke cautiously, describing unease rather than specific acts. She did not want to burden him with knowledge that offered no solution. Jacob listened and said little. Inside, something tightened. He had lived long enough to understand where such attention led. Still, he believed that restraint was possible. He believed that by remaining invisible, by avoiding confrontation, they might endure. This belief had sustained him through decades. He clung to it even as evidence mounted against it. The first open injustice occurred on a Sunday afternoon, during the brief hours when work slowed. Sarah was resting near her cabin, sitting on a low stool to ease the strain on her back. Jacob was nearby, repairing a tool. Their closeness was permitted but watched. Kutcher approached with two drivers. He commented loudly on Sarah's idleness, ignoring the visible signs of her condition. He ordered her to stand and carry water from the well, a task unnecessary at that hour and easily performed by others. Sarah rose without complaint. She did not argue. As she lifted the bucket, Kutcher remarked on her posture and laughed. The drivers looked away. Jacob remained still, his hands tightening around the tool he held. When Sarah returned, her breathing was labored. Kutcher dismissed her with a gesture, satisfied. The cruelty lay not in the task itself, but in its intention. It was meant to assert power, to remind. That evening, Jacob said nothing. He helped Sarah lie down and brought her water. His silence was deliberate. Words could not change what had happened, but his mind began to turn over possibilities he had long kept buried. From that day forward, Jacob watched Kutcher more closely. He noted when the overseer approached Sarah and when he did not. He observed how Kutcher spoke about her to others, his tone carrying a mixture of ownership and challenge. Jacob also noticed Whitfield's schedule with renewed attention, though he did not yet understand why. The injustice had not yet reached its climax. No irreversible act had occurred, but the signs were unmistakable. Authority was behaving unfairly, not in isolated incidents but as pattern. Fear spread quietly, not through screams or spectacle, but through tightened routines and careful silences. At Thornwood, everyone understood what these signs meant. When rules tightened without cause, when scrutiny increased without explanation, something was coming. No one knew when or in what form. They only knew to brace themselves. Jacob still believed he could endure. He still believed that patience might outlast cruelty. But the ground beneath that belief had begun to erode, grain by grain, unnoticed until it no longer held firm. By mid-March, Thornwood Plantation no longer moved with its former predictability. The hours still passed in their accustomed order, but the weight within them had changed. What had once been routine now carried strain. Tasks took longer not because bodies were slower, but because attention had sharpened to a point that made every movement feel examined. The overseer increased quotas without announcing them as such. Field hands were told their baskets were light even when they matched previous measures. Drivers were instructed to push harder, and when they hesitated, they were reminded of the ease with which their privileges could be revoked. No single order marked the shift. It emerged through repetition, through correction layered upon correction. Jacob's work at the cotton gin was interrupted more often. Kutcher stood nearby while he worked, offering unnecessary commentary. When Jacob finished a repair, Kutcher tested it roughly, as though hopping to find fault. Each time the mechanism held, Kutcher's irritation grew. Skill without deference unsettled him. Inside the big house, Sarah's days became longer. Mistress Whitfield assigned her additional duties under the language of preparation and cleanliness. Sarah was instructed to remain on her feet for hours at a time. When she moved slowly, she was accused of laziness. When she asked quietly for brief rest, she was told that pregnancy did not excuse weakness. Other house servants noticed and said nothing. Silence was a form of protection. Association with punishment risked sharing it. Master Whitfield's presence became more frequent in the afternoons. He entered the kitchen without purpose and remained there, watching. His comments grew more direct, though still framed as observation. He spoke of fertility, of strong children, of the value of good stock. These remarks were delivered casually, as though discussing livestock or tools. Sarah learned to anticipate his arrival by listening for his footsteps on the stairs. She positioned herself near others when possible, but privacy was often imposed rather than avoided. When he spoke to her directly, she answered briefly and returned to her work. Compliance did not deter him. It only delayed escalation. Jacob noticed that Sarah began to avoid the big house whenever she could. She volunteered for tasks that took her farther from its interior, even when they were more physically demanding. He understood her choice without needing explanation. Distance offered limited safety, but it was the only kind available. At night the quarters were quieter than usual. Songs were fewer. Conversations ended abruptly when footsteps approached. People slept lightly, waking at small sounds. The patrols rode more often, sometimes passing twice in a single night. Lantern lights swept across cabin walls, lingering as though searching for movement. Rumors circulated of new laws discussed in Mobile, of meetings among plantation owners. The language of fear was familiar. When owners gathered, restrictions followed. Fear among the powerful translated into punishment for the powerless. One evening, Jacob was summoned to the big house to repair a door latch. Mistress Whitfield supervised closely, her instructions sharp and impatient. When Jacob finished, she inspected his work in silence before dismissing him with a nod. As he turned to leave, Master Whitfield entered the room. He addressed Jacob directly, something he rarely did. His tone was casual, almost conversational. He commented on Jacob's strength, his reliability. He asked how long Jacob had been at Thornwood. Jacob answered truthfully, keeping his eyes lowered. Whitfield then asked about Sarah. He spoke her name slowly as though tasting it. He remarked on her usefulness and her condition. Jacob's posture remained unchanged. He responded only when required, his words neutral. Whitfield smiled slightly and dismissed him. Jacob left the house with his heart beating harder than usual. The exchange had contained no threat that could be named, but its meaning was unmistakable. Attention had shifted from observation to intention. The following day, Kutcher assigned Sarah to work in the kitchen alone during the afternoon hours, sending the other servants to tasks elsewhere. The order was given without explanation. Sarah understood immediately. She considered feigning illness but knew the cost of refusal. She entered the kitchen and began her work. Master Whitfield arrived less than an hour later. The encounter that followed was brief, interrupted by Mistress Whitfield's unexpected return. No violence occurred. No one raised a voice. but the boundaries that had previously existed were crossed in ways that could not be undone. That evening, Sarah told Jacob only that she no longer felt safe in the big house. She did not describe the details. She did not need to. Jacob listened without interrupting. He nodded once and said he understood. From that point, Jacob began to consider possibilities he had avoided for years. He reviewed what he knew of the land beyond Thornwood, of the swamp's depth and its dangers. He thought about distance, about disappearance. These thoughts did not yet form plans. They existed as questions without answers. Pressure continued to build. Kutcher's behavior toward Jacob sharpened. He criticized minor delays. He assigned Jacob physically demanding tasks for no apparent reason. Each assignment seemed designed to test endurance rather than productivity. One afternoon, Kutcher accused Jacob of deliberately slowing work on the gin. The accusation was unfounded. Jacob explained calmly, pointing out the worn parts that required careful alignment. Kutcher responded by striking him across the shoulder with his whip, not hard enough to draw blood, but hard enough to assert authority. The blow was public. Several field hands witnessed it. No one reacted. Jacob absorbed the strike without sound. He resumed his work when ordered. The moment passed, but it did not fade. That night Jacob sat alone outside his cabin long after others had gone inside. The air was cool. Insects moved through the grass. The swamp beyond the trees was dark and still. He thought of his mother's voice, of lessons whispered long ago about patience and endurance. He wondered whether patience had limits. The next morning, Sarah was called to the big house earlier than usual. She returned hours later, her face pale, her movements stiff. She said nothing. She lay down and did not rise again that day. Jacob brought her water and sat beside her in silence. Aunt Ruth visited in the evening, examining Sarah with practiced care. She spoke quietly to Jacob afterward, her voice low. She warned him that stress could harm the child. She did not need to elaborate on the source of that stress. The plantation structure tightened further. Passes were checked more frequently. Evening gatherings were discouraged outright. Anyone found lingering outside after dark was questioned. The patrols rode closer, their presence more aggressive. By now, everyone sensed that something irreversible was approaching. Fear no longer lay beneath the surface. It had risen into daily awareness. People moved with caution that bordered on paralysis. Jacob still worked. He still complied. But inside, his calculations changed. Survival through obedience had carried him this far, but it offered diminishing returns. Each concession demanded another. Each silence invited further violation. The pressure was no longer external alone. It pressed inward, compressing choices until only a narrow space remained. Jacob did not yet know what he would do when that space closed. He only knew that it was closing. This was the moment before rupture, when control increased and options narrowed, and the system revealed its nature not through spectacle but through inevitability. What came next would not be an accident. It would be the result of accumulated force finally finding release. The morning of March 14th began without distinction. Dawn came pale and humid, the air already heavy despite the early hour. The bell rang as it always did. People rose from their pallets and moved through familiar motions. Nothing in the sky or soil signaled that the day would carry a different weight. At Thornwood, violence did not announce itself. It arrived through ordinary channels. Jacob left his cabin before full light, careful not to wake Sarah. Her sleep had been uneven for days, broken by discomfort and worry that neither of them spoke aloud. He paused at the door for a moment, watching her breathe, then turned away and joined the path toward the gin. The cotton gin required attention after the previous harvest. Metal teeth had warped under strain, and the main shaft had loosened. Jacob worked alone, as he often did, his movements steady and precise. The sound of hammer against metal carried across the clearing. Sweat gathered quickly along his back. He focused on the work, narrowing his attention to the task at hand, as he had learned to do whenever thought threatened to wander. Inside the big house, Sarah worked in the kitchen. Mistress Whitfield had planned a dinner for neighboring owners, which meant extra preparation and stricter oversight. The kitchen grew hot as fires burned steadily. Dough was kneaded, meats prepared, vegetables cut. Sarah worked without pause, her movements efficient despite the strain of her condition. By midday, Master Whitfield had begun drinking. This was not unusual. What changed was the timing and the manner in which he entered the kitchen. He did not speak at first. He stood close enough that Sarah could smell the liquor on his breath. The other servants found reasons to leave, one by one, until Sarah was alone. Whitfield commented on her pregnancy, framing his words as assessment. He spoke of value and future return. He touched her abdomen without asking, then lingered. Sarah kept her eyes lowered. Her voice remained quiet when she answered. She attempted to step away. When she asked him to stop, she did so carefully, appealing not to decency but to ownership, reminding him that harm to her body could damage what he considered his property. The calculation was deliberate. It was the only argument permitted. Whitfield struck her without warning. The blow was hard enough to turn her sideways into the table. Utensils fell. Flour dust rose into the air. He seized her arm and began dragging her toward the back stairs. Mistress Whitfield entered the kitchen at that moment. She did not ask what had happened. She saw only that her husband's attention had been directed elsewhere. Her response was immediate and cold. She accused Sarah of seduction. She did not acknowledge resistance. She framed the situation as disobedience. The decision was made quickly. The overseer was summoned. Sarah was ordered to the post. The distance from the kitchen to the quarters was short, but it took time. Sarah struggled, her movements awkward under the weight of her pregnancy. Her pleas were ignored. Slaves emerged from cabins and workshops, drawn by the sound. They formed a loose circle around the post, not by choice but by expectation. Jacob heard Sarah's voice before he saw her. The sound cut across the yard and reached him at the gin. He dropped his tools and ran. When he reached the quarters, she was already bound, her wrists tied above her head, her body positioned so that her back faced the post. Kutcher approached slowly, his whip coiled in his hand. He spoke loudly, explaining his reasoning as though delivering instruction. He announced a reduced number of lashes, citing concern for the unborn child. His tone suggested generosity. Jacob stood among the others, his face still, his hands clenched. He did not move forward. He did not speak. He knew what would happen if he did. He knew the result would not spare Sarah. It would only add his body to the display. The first lash struck with force. Sarah cried out. The sound was sharp and involuntary. The second followed after a measured pause. Kutcher took his time. Each strike was deliberate, placed to maximize pain without immediate death. Blood appeared quickly, dark against torn fabric. By the 10th lash, Sarah's voice had begun to break. By the 20th, her body sagged against the ropes. Jacob counted each strike, though he did not intend to. The numbers fixed themselves in his mind without effort. At one point, Sarah spoke his name. She told him not to act. She told him to think of the child. Her words were strained but clear. They carried instruction even as her body was failing. When the whip struck her lower back, her body lurched forward, her abdomen hitting the post. The sound that followed was different from the others. It was a sound of internal injury. Jacob took a step forward before stopping himself. An older man beside him gripped his arm, holding him back without looking at him. The punishment ended when Kutcher decided it had. Sarah was cut down and carried to the medical cabin. The crowd dispersed slowly, no one speaking. The post remained stained. Jacob followed Sarah to the cabin. Aunt Ruth worked quietly, cleaning wounds with water and salt. Sarah regained consciousness briefly, crying out as the salt touched torn flesh. Jacob held her hand and spoke to her, telling her she would recover. He spoke without conviction. Over the next days, Sarah's condition worsened. She bled, her fever rose. Aunt Ruth used what remedies she had. None were sufficient. On the third day, Sarah miscarried. The child was born dead, fully formed. Jacob held the body. He did not cry. He noted details without thinking to do so. The weight, the stillness, the absence of breath. Sarah's grief was louder than his. She spoke of murder. She named those responsible. Her strength faded quickly after that. Infection set in. On the afternoon of March 18th, Sarah spoke clearly one last time. She asked Jacob to remember her. Then she died. Jacob remained seated beside her for some time after. He did not move until Aunt Ruth touched his shoulder. When he stood, his movements were precise and unhurried. Sarah was buried the following day in the slave cemetery beyond the quarters. The grave was unmarked. A brief prayer was spoken. Work resumed afterward. In the days that followed, Jacob moved through his tasks as before. He spoke when spoken to. He showed no outward change. Inside, something fundamental had shifted. Survival through obedience no longer held meaning. The line had been crossed. The system had taken everything he had preserved himself for. He did not act immediately. He understood that haste would lead only to his own death without consequence. Instead, he observed. He waited. He gathered what he would need. His grief did not express itself in tears or rage. It hardened into resolve. By the time he left Thornwood, the man who had believed in endurance no longer existed. What remained was something shaped by loss and clarity, patient and deliberate, no longer concerned with survival alone. Jacob did not leave Thornwood in anger. He left in silence, carrying no visible sign of intention. For several days after Sarah's burial, he remained where he was expected to be. He worked the gin. He repaired a fence along the western boundary. He answered questions briefly and without emotion. Those who watched him saw only grief managed through restraint, a condition familiar enough to draw no comment. This period of stillness was not indecision. It was preparation of a different kind. Jacob understood that resistance, if it came at all, would not begin with confrontation. It would begin with memory, with attention, with refusing to let events pass unmarked. At night he lay awake in his cabin and listened. The plantation sounded different now. Where he had once heard routine, he now heard structure. Footsteps marked authority. Horses marked enforcement. Even the insects seemed to pause when patrols passed. He noted times and intervals, not with pencil or paper, but by repetition until patterns settled into certainty. Jacob began to walk closer to the tree line in the evenings, never crossing it, never lingering long enough to attract notice. He learned where the ground hardened and where it gave way. He observed which paths animals favored and which were avoided. These observations were not new to him, but now they carried different weight. He spoke little to others, but he listened. Quiet resistance often took the form of attention shared in fragments. An older man mentioned which patrol rider drank heavily. A woman spoke of which nights the overseer returned late. These details were offered without expectation, not as plans but as acknowledgement that watching itself had value. Jacob did not speak of Sarah's death beyond what was necessary. He did not repeat the story. He did not allow it to become rumor. Instead, he held it intact within himself, preserving its details without embellishment. This was his first act of resistance, refusing to let what had happened dissolve into general suffering. During this time, he carved a small piece of cypress wood he had taken from the swamp edge weeks earlier. The object took shape slowly, worked on in brief moments of privacy. It was not decorative. It served no practical function. When finished, it fit easily in the palm of his hand. He kept it wrapped in cloth beneath his pallet. It was not a symbol meant for others. It was a record, a way of fixing memory in form. Jacob also began to mark time differently. Days were no longer counted by work assignments or meals but by observation. He noted when Kutcher drank and when he did not. He noted which men laughed and which watched. He noted the absence left by Sarah's cabin, the way people avoided looking at it directly. The plantation continued as though nothing had changed. Quotas were enforced. Orders were given. Punishments occurred elsewhere, unrelated yet connected. This continuation was itself a form of denial. Jacob understood that the system depended on forgetting as much as on force. One evening, Aunt Ruth spoke to him briefly as she passed his cabin. She did not mention Sarah. She did not offer comfort. She told him only that remembering was dangerous but necessary. Her voice was low, her tone practical. Then she moved on. Jacob took this as confirmation rather than instruction. He began to plan not in terms of action but in terms of absence. He considered how long it would take before his disappearance was noticed. He considered which tools could be taken without immediate detection. He did not hurry this thinking. Quiet resistance required patience equal to obedience, but directed elsewhere. On the third night after Sarah's burial, Jacob removed a loose board beneath his pallet and placed the carved cypress piece inside, along with a small knife he had acquired earlier and kept hidden. He did not take it out again. The act itself mattered more than immediate use. He also began to observe the swamp not as refuge but as witness. He walked its edge in daylight when allowed, gathering herbs as pretext. He learned where sound carried and where it was absorbed. He watched how water moved after rain, how quickly footprints vanished. In the quarters, people noticed that Jacob spoke even less than before. His grief was interpreted as inward turning, a common response. No one suspected preparation. Preparation did not look like defiance. It looked like compliance refined to near invisibility. Jacob's resistance remained internal, but it was no longer passive. He was no longer enduring in order to survive. He was enduring in order to remember accurately, to preserve cause and responsibility in a world that erased both. When he finally decided to leave, the decision felt less like departure than continuation. He did not see himself as abandoning Thornwood. He saw himself as carrying its truths beyond its boundaries. On the night he left, he paused at the edge of the quarters and looked back once. The cabins were dark. The post stood where it always had. Nothing acknowledged his movement. That, too, was part of the system. Jacob stepped into the trees without sound. Behind him, Thornwood resumed its rhythms. Ahead of him, the swamp closed in, indifferent and exact. His resistance remained quiet, but it was no longer contained. Jacob's absence was noticed the morning after he did not report for work. At first, it caused little concern. Men sometimes fell ill. Others were reassigned without notice. A driver checked Jacob's cabin and found it empty. The pallet lay undisturbed. The small space held nothing of value beyond what had always been there. When the driver reported this to Overseer Kutcher, the reaction was measured rather than alarmed. Runaways were common enough to be accounted for within existing procedures. A note was made. Questions were asked. No urgency marked the response. The assumption was that Jacob would be found quickly, frightened into flight by grief and incapable of sustained escape. Master Whitfield was informed later that morning. He regarded the information with irritation rather than concern. A skilled laborer represented loss of investment, but not one that required extraordinary measures. He ordered the patrols notified and authorized a reward. The amount was standard. There was no suggestion of deeper inquiry. The patrols rode out that evening following the usual routes. They questioned enslaved people they encountered, asked after passes, demanded information. Most had nothing to offer. A few spoke of grief, of a man who had lost his wife and child. The patrols noted this and moved on. Grief explained flight well enough. For several days, the search followed established patterns. Men rode the roads. Dogs were brought in briefly, then dismissed when trails faded into water and undergrowth. The swamp was treated as boundary rather than destination. Patrols rarely entered it beyond the edges. It was considered hostile terrain, unsuitable for prolonged pursuit. This reluctance was framed as practicality, not fear. In reports delivered to Whitfield and others, The swamp was described as impassable, dangerous, unworthy of risk for a single runaway. The language shifted responsibility from those searching to the land itself. As days passed without success, the tone of discussion changed. Jacob's name was mentioned less often. Attention returned to planting schedules and quotas. Loss was absorbed into routine. The system required this absorption to function. Prolonged focus on one escaped man risked acknowledging vulnerability. Within Thornwood, Sarah's death was not discussed. No record existed of the punishment that preceded it. The miscarriage and subsequent death were attributed vaguely to illness. Mistress Whitfield spoke of unfortunate outcomes and divine will. Her words framed the event as natural rather than inflicted. Aunt Ruth was warned not to speak of the circumstances. The warning was indirect, delivered through a driver rather than an order. She understood its meaning. Silence was demanded not through threat alone but through expectation. Jacob's work was reassigned. The gin repairs were completed by others, less skilled and more cautious. Breakdowns increased. Kutcher responded with punishment rather than acknowledgement of cause. Productivity suffered, but explanations remained external. Fault was always located in laziness or incompetence, never in the loss of experienced labor. Meanwhile, rumors reached Thornwood from beyond its boundaries. A patrol rider had not returned from a night route. A man was found dead near a water crossing. Details were scarce and inconsistent. Some spoke of accident, others of violence. These accounts were dismissed by those in authority as exaggeration or coincidence. When a second patrolman failed to report, concerns surfaced briefly. Meetings were held. Extra riders were assigned. Yet the language used remained careful. No one spoke of connection. Each incident was treated as isolated, an unfortunate occurrence in dangerous territory. Master Whitfield addressed his peers in private, assuring them that order remained intact. He emphasized the strength of the patrol system and the loyalty of overseers. To acknowledge a pattern would be to acknowledge weakness, and weakness invited challenge. Official records reflected this stance. Deaths were logged without elaboration. Causes were generalized. Names were entered and moved past. The absence of detail was itself a form of denial, reducing events to administrative entries. Within the quarters, enslaved people noticed the tension even as it was officially minimized. Patrols rode with greater caution. Men spoke more softly. Night passed with longer stretches of silence between hoofbeats. Fear was present, but it was unspoken. Jacob, unseen and unmentioned, remained close enough to observe these shifts. He did not act openly. He watched how the system responded to loss by narrowing explanation rather than expanding it. Each death was absorbed into bureaucracy. Each absence was rendered manageable through language. This institutional denial extended beyond Thornwood. County authorities were reluctant to pursue investigations that might disrupt agricultural output. The deaths of patrolmen were regrettable but not treated as crisis. Resources were limited. Priorities were clear. In this environment, Jacob's resistance remained largely invisible. His actions were interpreted not as deliberate challenge, but as a series of misfortunes. This misinterpretation was essential to the system's self-preservation. To name, resistance would be to admit its possibility. As weeks passed, denial hardened into posture. Authorities spoke of returning order. Rewards were adjusted quietly, without announcement. Patrol routes were altered, not in acknowledgement of threat but under the guise of efficiency. The institution maintained its narrative. The system was sound, disruptions temporary, control intact. Anything that contradicted this narrative was minimized or erased. In this way, denial became policy, enforced not through decree but through omission. Jacob's existence, like Sarah's death, was being written out of the record. This erasure was not accidental. It was the mechanism by which the institution defended itself against truth. truth did not announce itself at Thornwood or anywhere else in Mobile County. It emerged slowly, unevenly, through fragments that resisted suppression. It surfaced not because the institution allowed it, but because denial required coordination the system could not fully maintain. The first clear break in the official posture came when a body was found along a stretch of road north of the river. It was identified as one of the patrol riders assigned to the Eastern Circuit. The man's horse had returned alone the previous night, a fact initially dismissed as accident. When the body was discovered, the explanation grew more complicated. The wound was unmistakable. It was not the result of a fall or animal attack. Those who saw it understood immediately, even if they did not say so aloud. A report was filed using neutral language. Violence was noted without attribution. The possibility of resistance was not named. 2 days later, another body was found farther south, this one closer to the edge of the swamp. Again, the cause of death was recorded without elaboration. Again, the connection was avoided. It was no longer possible to treat these events as coincidence among those who lived near the routes. Farmers spoke quietly of danger. Riders began traveling in pairs without being ordered to do so. Patrol schedules were adjusted unofficially. Men carried weapons more carefully. Within Thornwood, these changes were felt before they were explained. Guards were posted closer to the big house. Kutcher altered his routines, avoiding isolation. Mistress Whitfield withdrew further from daily oversight, issuing orders through others. Despite these measures, uncertainty grew. The system had responded with fortification but without naming the cause. This created tension rather than reassurance. When fear is not acknowledged, it multiplies. Among the enslaved, stories circulated cautiously. No one claimed certainty. Details varied. Some spoke of a man in the swamp who watched patrols before striking. Others spoke of someone who knew the land too well to be followed. Jacob's name was not spoken openly, but it hovered in implication. These accounts were not shared as celebration. They were shared as information, passed quietly and altered with each telling. What mattered was not accuracy, but recognition that authority was no longer absolute. The truth also surfaced through absence. Patrols stopped riding certain roads at night. Overseers declined to pursue runaways into wooded areas. Orders were given with less confidence, their tone sharpened to compensate. At a meeting of local owners held in Mobile, the issue could no longer be avoided. Several men spoke of losses. Others dismissed them as exaggeration. One man argued that naming the threat would only embolden it. Another insisted that silence had already failed. No consensus was reached. The meeting ended without resolution, its participants divided between fear and denial. Written records continued to obscure events. Deaths were logged without context. No formal investigation was announced. Yet privately, resources were redirected. Men with experience in pursuit were consulted. Advice was sought from beyond the county. The truth was surfacing not through acknowledgement but through reaction. Each adjustment signaled recognition without admission. At Thornwood, the most telling sign came when the whipping post was left unused for several days. No announcement accompanied this change. It was simply avoided. Punishments were postponed or reduced. Kutcher enforced discipline through threat rather than action. This restraint did not reflect mercy. It reflected calculation. Public punishment required confidence. Confidence had eroded. Enslaved people noticed. They spoke of it in careful language, noting what did not happen rather than what did. Absence became evidence. Sarah's name began to circulate again, whispered in connection with events beyond the plantation. Her death, once attributed to illness, was reconsidered privately. Aunt Ruth spoke to a few she trusted, recounting what she had witnessed. She did not embellish. She did not draw conclusions. She simply refused to forget. Memory spread where records did not. Truth moved through people rather than paper. By the time authorities accepted that a deliberate pattern existed, it was already too late to contain. The recognition came quietly, without declaration. Men spoke of a threat that understood them, that moved patiently, that did not seek escape but consequence. This understanding altered behavior in ways that could not be reversed. Patrols rode with fear. Overseers avoided isolation. Owners slept lightly. The truth had surfaced not as narrative but as condition. It did not require official recognition to exert force. It changed how power was exercised and how it was perceived. Jacob himself was never named in any formal statement. His existence remained officially unconfirmed, yet his presence shaped decisions across the county. This contradiction was tolerated because acknowledging it would require admitting that the system could be challenged from within. The institution continued to deny in words what it accepted in practice. This division marked the moment when control became performative rather than assured. Truth had surfaced, not as confession but as fracture. The events that followed did not arrive with resolution. There was no moment when authority reclaimed certainty or when fear dissolved into reassurance. Instead, the weeks after the final incidents passed in a prolonged state of unease, marked by adjustments that acknowledged loss without addressing cause. At Thornwood, routines resumed in altered form. Work continued, but oversight remained cautious. Kutcher avoided the edges of the fields. He no longer rode alone at dusk. His voice carried less confidence, relying more on threat than action. The whip was used sparingly, not from restraint but from calculation. Public punishment required an audience willing to believe in its inevitability. That belief had weakened. Mistress Whitfield withdrew almost entirely from visible management. Orders were delivered through intermediaries. Her presence was felt through absence, a retreat that signaled fear rather than authority. The big house remained lit at night longer than before. Guards stayed close, their vigilance uneven and strained. Master Whitfield spoke less of discipline and more of order. He emphasized productivity in meetings with other owners, framing recent disruptions as temporary disturbances. His language avoided naming individuals or motives. The narrative remained one of isolated incidents rather than systemic failure. Beyond Thornwood, Mobile County adjusted quietly. Patrol routes were shortened. Night rides became less frequent. Rewards were increased without public notice. Men spoke of danger in private but avoided committing such concerns to paper. No proclamation acknowledged what had occurred. Silence remained policy. In the absence of official explanation, rumor filled the space. Stories circulated unevenly, gaining and losing detail with each retelling. Some accounts exaggerated the number of deaths. Others claimed the man responsible had vanished entirely, swallowed by the swamp. No version was confirmed, but none were dismissed outright. For the enslaved, the aftermath unfolded differently. There was no celebration. There was no sense of victory. Instead, there was a quiet recalibration of what was possible. The certainty of absolute control had been disrupted, if only briefly. That disruption lingered. People spoke more carefully, but they also listened more closely. The knowledge that authority could be resisted, even at great cost, altered perception. It did not remove fear, but it complicated it. Fear now coexisted with memory. Sarah's death did not receive acknowledgement in any record. Her grave remained unmarked, her name absent from official accounts. Yet among those who had known her, she was remembered with precision. Details of her work, her voice, her condition were preserved through repetition. Remembering became an act of defiance. Aunt Ruth continued her duties until her strength failed. She spoke less often, but when she did, her words carried weight. She reminded others that silence was not the same as forgetting. Her caution was born of survival, but her memory resisted erasure. Jacob was never found. No body was recovered. No confirmation of his fate entered the record. Authorities eventually ceased active pursuit, citing lack of evidence and shifting priorities. His name appeared only once more in plantation accounts, listed as property absconded and unrecovered. This absence became its own form of presence. The uncertainty surrounding his end unsettled those who required closure to reassert control. Without a body, without confession or capture, the system lacked the finality it depended upon. In time, other concerns displaced this one. Planting seasons arrived, markets shifted, political tensions grew elsewhere. Thornwood continued to operate, though never with the same assurance. Some laborers were sold, others were acquired. The land remained productive, but the atmosphere did not fully recover. Years later, when Thornwood's fields began to fail and ownership changed hands, the earlier disruptions were cited as mismanagement rather than warning. History was simplified for convenience. Yet the memory endured where it mattered most, in quiet conversations. In altered behavior and the careful way people watched and waited, the impact remained. The story was not preserved as legend or triumph. It was preserved as fact, stripped of ornament. Jacob's actions did not dismantle the institution that produced them. They did not prevent future suffering. They did not redeem the losses that preceded them. What they did was expose the system's dependence on compliance and forgetting. In the end, there was no monument. There was no acknowledgement. The land absorbed the traces of violence as it always had. Water carried away blood. Vegetation closed over disturbed ground. What remained was the knowledge that injustice, when left unchecked, produces consequences that cannot always be managed or erased. This knowledge did not bring comfort. It did not offer instruction. It persisted without resolution. The aftermath of Thornwood was not marked by change that could be measured easily. It was marked by a quiet awareness that order had been disrupted and could be again. That awareness lingered long after names faded from memory. In this way, the story concluded not with closure but with residue. The system continued, altered but intact. Those within it continued as they had before, carrying forward what they could not speak aloud. History recorded little, memory carried the rest.